Feldwebel Karl-Heinz Böhmer pressed his face to the window of the transport train and watched America scroll past in the darkness and felt his understanding of the war collapse with every mile. It was November 1943. 3 weeks earlier, Böhmer had been a tank commander with the 21st Panzer Division in Tunisia, confident in final victory despite the temporary setbacks in North Africa. Now he sat in a converted passenger car with 47 other German prisoners, traveling through a country he had been assured was teetering on the edge of economic ruin. The train had left Newport News, Virginia, 6 hours ago. Since then, Böhmer had not seen a single moment of darkness on the ground below. The cities blazed with electric light, not the dim, rationed flicker of wartime Germany, but an extravagant flood of illumination that spilled from windows, street lamps, theater marquees, and automobile headlights. The automobiles were everywhere, streaming along highways in rivers of light that stretched to the horizon. Factories stood lit for night shifts, smoke rising from stacks that never stopped producing. Rail yards glowed with arc lamps as workers loaded freight cars with materials Böhmer could not identify onto trains headed in directions he could not fathom. There was no blackout. In Germany, a single unshielded candle could bring a fine or imprisonment. British bombers had taught the Reich to fear light. But here, 2,000 miles from the nearest enemy aircraft, America blazed as though darkness itself had been rationed out of existence. "This is not possible," murmured Unteroffizier Wendt from the seat beside him. Wendt had been staring out the opposite window for the past hour, watching a factory complex slide past, a facility so vast its perimeter fencing took 4 full minutes to clear at the train's speed. "They told us the Americans were struggling. They told us their factories were failing." They had been told many things. Böhmer remembered the newsreels shown before the war, images of American breadlines, of hollow-eyed workers begging for employment, of a nation broken by economic collapse and too decadent to recover. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda had painted a portrait of a mongrel nation, racially impure and spiritually weak, propped up by Jewish financiers and incapable of the sacrifices that total war demanded. He remembered believing it. Now he watched a freight train thunder past on a parallel track, a train that seemed to have no end. Boxcar after boxcar after boxcar, hundreds of them, carrying war material to ports he could not name, destined for fronts he had once believed Germany was winning. "How long is that train?" someone asked from the back of the car. No one answered. They had stopped counting at 200 cars. The train was still passing. A guard, an American private who looked barely old enough to shave, noticed the prisoners staring. He grinned and said something in English that Böhmer didn't understand. Another prisoner, an Obergefreiter who had worked as a hotel clerk before the war, translated quietly. "He says this is a small one. He says the long trains run on the western routes." Böhmer turned back to the window. The freight train was still passing. Still passing. The rhythm of its wheels had become a kind of mechanical heartbeat, steady and inexhaustible. What Feldwebel Karl-Heinz Böhmer did not yet know, what none of the men in that transport car had begun to grasp, was that this single night's journey would do more damage to their faith in German victory than any battlefield defeat, that the lights and the trains and the factories they witnessed were not exceptions but examples, that the country they had dismissed as soft and corrupt was producing more war material in a single month than the Reich produced in a year. They had been captured by the Americans. Now they were about to be defeated by America itself. German confidence in their assessment of America was not delusion. It was data. The Wehrmacht's intelligence services had compiled extensive analyses of American industrial capacity throughout the 1930s, and the portrait that emerged was not flattering. The Great Depression had gutted American manufacturing. Between 1929 and 1933, industrial production had fallen by nearly half. Steel mills stood idle. Automobile plants had closed. Shipyards that had once built the world's merchant fleets now rusted in silence. Unemployment had reached 25%, a quarter of the workforce reduced to breadlines and charity. German military planners studied these figures with satisfaction. The Americans had proven what National Socialist ideology had always maintained. Liberal democracies were economically unstable, vulnerable to the boom and bust cycles that centrally planned economies could avoid. While Germany rebuilt under the Führer's guidance, full employment, roaring factories, the Autobahn stretching across the Reich, America wallowed in self-inflicted misery. General Major Georg Thomas, head of the Wehrmacht's War Economy and Armaments Office, delivered a comprehensive assessment to the German High Command in March 1940. His report acknowledged American industrial potential, but emphasized critical weaknesses. The United States possesses significant raw material resources and theoretical manufacturing capacity. However, several factors limit the practical application of these assets. First, the American workforce lacks the discipline and technical training of German labor. Their factory workers are accustomed to short hours and high wages. They will not accept the sacrifices that total war demands. Second, American industry is organized for consumer production, not military output. Converting automobile factories to tank production requires years of retooling. Third, and most significantly, the American political system is incapable of the centralized direction that modern warfare requires. Their Congress debates while we act. Their president negotiates while we command. By the time American industry mobilizes, if it mobilizes at all, the war will be decided. The assessment was logical. It was supported by evidence. It was catastrophically wrong. But in 1940, and even into 1942, the data seemed to confirm German assumptions. American military production in 1939 had been negligible. A peacetime army of 190,000 men, supported by a defense industry that produced fewer than 3,000 aircraft per year. Germany, by comparison, was producing over 8,000. The Wehrmacht had more tanks in a single Panzer Corps than the entire United States Army possessed. American factories were making refrigerators and automobiles, while German factories made weapons. Even after Pearl Harbor, German analysts remained skeptical that America could transform quickly enough to matter. Reichsminister Albert Speer, who would later oversee German armaments production, recalled a briefing in early 1942. We were shown projections of American industrial capacity, what they claimed they would produce by 1943. By 1944, the numbers were absurd. No economy could expand so quickly. We assumed the figures were propaganda designed to intimidate. We did not take them seriously. The propaganda ministry reinforced these conclusions for public consumption. Newsreels depicted America as a nation of gangsters, jazz musicians, and racial chaos. A mongrel society incapable of the unity that war demanded. Radio broadcasts mocked American soldiers as soft, raised on Hollywood and Coca-Cola, unable to endure the hardships that German youth accepted as duty. Dr. Joseph Goebbels himself set the tone in a 1942 speech. The Americans believe they can defeat German will with American money. They count their dollars while we count our victories. But wars are not won by accountants. Wars are won by soldiers, by sacrifice, by the unbreakable spirit of a united people. The Americans have none of these things. They have only their wealth, and wealth in the end is merely a more comfortable form of weakness. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht absorbed these messages through years of repetition. They believed them not because they were stupid, but because the evidence seemed overwhelming. Germany had conquered Europe in 2 years. America had not conquered anything. Germany produced the finest tanks, the finest aircraft, the finest infantry in the world. America produced jazz records and motion pictures. The mathematics of war, as German planners understood them, did not favor the United States. What German intelligence could not measure, what no analysis could capture, was what happened when a nation that had mastered the production of automobiles decided to produce tanks instead, when a workforce that had built skyscrapers decided to build bombers, when an economy organized around consumer abundance redirected that abundance toward a single purpose, the complete destruction of the Third Reich. The prisoners on that train through Virginia were about to receive an education that no intelligence briefing had prepared them for. They were about to see what American weakness looked like when it stopped being weak. The decision to bring German prisoners to America was born from logistics, not strategy. The psychological devastation it caused was an accident of geography. In the spring of 1942, the United States War Department faced a problem that no military planner had anticipated. Too many prisoners, too quickly. The North African campaign was producing captures at a rate that overwhelmed existing infrastructure. British camps in Egypt and Libya were full. Temporary facilities in Morocco and Algeria were bursting, and the tide of surrendering Axis soldiers showed no signs of slowing. Provost Marshal General Alan Gullion proposed the solution in a memorandum dated April 14, 1942. The continental United States offers virtually unlimited capacity for prisoner detention. Our existing military installations can be adapted for this purpose. Our agricultural sector requires labor that prisoners can provide, and the Atlantic Ocean provides a barrier more secure than any fence. I recommend immediate preparation for the transfer of Axis prisoners to camps within the United States. The recommendation was approved within weeks. By summer, the first camps were under construction, eventually numbering over 500 facilities spread across 45 states, from Camp Blanding in Florida to Camp Beale in California, from Camp McCoy in Wisconsin to Camp Hearn in Texas. The system would ultimately hold over 425,000 German prisoners, along with smaller numbers of Italians and Japanese. But the man who shaped the prisoner experience was not a general. He was a bureaucrat with a theory. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Gruenwald had served in the Army's Psychological Operations Division before transferring to the office of the Provost Marshal General in 1943. He believed that prisoner of war camps offered an unprecedented opportunity, not merely to detain enemy soldiers, but to transform them. His philosophy, outlined in a series of internal memoranda, was elegant in its simplicity. Show them. The German soldier has been systematically misinformed about the United States, Gruenwald wrote in September 1943. He believes our nation is economically weak, racially divided, and spiritually corrupt. These beliefs sustain his will to fight. The most effective countermeasure is not argument, but observation. We should not tell prisoners they are wrong about America. We should show them. Let them see our factories. Let them see our farms. Let them see our abundance. Reality is more persuasive than propaganda. Gruenwald's approach was controversial. Some officers argued that prisoners should be treated with deliberate harshness, not torture, which violated the Geneva Convention, but a calculated austerity that would remind them they had lost. Others believed that ideological re-education programs modeled on Soviet techniques should be implemented to actively denazify the prisoner population. Gruenwald rejected both approaches. Harshness breeds resentment, not reflection, he argued. Indoctrination breeds resistance, not conversion. What breaks faith in a belief system is not persecution, but irrelevance. When a German prisoner sees American abundance with his own eyes, he does not conclude that his leaders lied to him. He concludes that his leaders did not matter, that the war was lost before it began, that nothing Germany could have done would have changed the outcome. This realization is more devastating than any punishment we could inflict. The transportation process itself became the first stage of this psychological campaign, though Gruenwald always insisted it was not a campaign at all, merely a refusal to hide what America was. Prisoners captured in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy were processed through transit camps before being loaded onto transport ships for the Atlantic crossing. The ships themselves were a revelation. German prisoners accustomed to military austerity found themselves sleeping in bunks with clean linens. They ate 3 meals a day, meals that included fresh meat, white bread, butter, and vegetables. They received cigarettes, chocolate, and reading material. The guards were not brutal. They were bored. The atmosphere was not punitive, it was procedural. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller, captured at Tunis in May 1943, recalled the voyage in a post-war memoir. We expected to be treated as enemies. We were treated as cargo, valuable cargo that must arrive undamaged. The Americans fed us better than the Wehrmacht had fed us in the field. I gained 4 kilograms on the crossing. Some of my men thought it was a trick, fattening us for slave labor. It was not a trick. It was simply how Americans did things. They had so much food, they could afford to waste it on prisoners. This was the first moment I understood we might not win the war. The ships docked at Newport News, Virginia, or Boston, or New York, and then the prisoners were loaded onto trains. The trains traveled at night, but not because the army wanted to hide the prisoners from the American public. They traveled at night because the rail network was congested with war material during the day, and prisoner transport was a low priority. The schedule was pure logistics. The psychological effect was pure accident. At night, America revealed itself in light. The prisoners pressed against windows and watched a nation that had no reason to hide. A nation that blazed with electricity while Europe cowered in darkness, that moved goods in quantities that defied comprehension, that built and produced and consumed on a scale that German planners had dismissed as impossible. Grunwald had not planned this. No one had planned this. America simply existed, and the prisoners simply saw it, and what they saw broke something inside them that years of combat had not touched. They arrived at the camps as soldiers. They arrived as men who were beginning to understand they had already lost. But understanding did not come easily, and for many, it did not come at all. The first German prisoners to arrive in the United States, veterans of the Africa Corps, hardened by 2 years of desert warfare, were not men inclined to abandon their convictions at the sight of electric lights. They had survived Rommel's offensives and Montgomery's counterattacks. They had endured thirst and sandstorms and British artillery. They were not about to be defeated by American abundance. Camp Shelby, Mississippi, December 1943. Oberleutnant Werner Kreisler gathered his men in the barracks after their first full day on American soil and delivered an assessment that many of them wanted to hear. "What we have seen is a trick," Kreisler said. "The Americans are showing us their best. They are showing us their cities, their factories, their lights. They want us to believe they are strong. But think, if they were truly strong, would they need to convince us? A strong nation does not perform for prisoners. A strong nation fights. And where are the American soldiers fighting? In Italy, where they advance at a crawl. In the Pacific, where they die by thousands on tiny islands. Their strength is an illusion. Their lights are a stage set. Do not be fooled." The speech was met with applause. It was also, for many prisoners, a necessary defense against a reality too painful to accept. Psychologically, the early months of American captivity were a battleground. Prisoners who had maintained faith through years of combat now found that faith assaulted not by enemies but by evidence. The human mind does not surrender its core beliefs easily, and for soldiers who had built their identities around National Socialist ideology, around German superiority, around the myth of American decadence, the evidence had to be rejected, reinterpreted, or rationalized away. The rationalizations took predictable forms. Some prisoners insisted that what they saw was exceptional, that they had been deliberately routed through America's wealthiest regions, shown its most impressive facilities, fed its finest food. The deprivation they had been told about surely existed elsewhere, in the slums and ghettos hidden from prisoner transport routes. Oberfeldwebel Gerhard Stahl of the 15th Panzer Division maintained this position throughout his captivity. They showed us what they wanted us to see: New York, Chicago, the factories. But America is large. They cannot have hidden all their failures. The breadlines are somewhere. The hunger is somewhere. We simply were not permitted to see it. Others argued that American abundance was itself a weakness. Yes, the factories were impressive. Yes, the food was plentiful. But these comforts had made Americans soft. German soldiers had learned to fight on empty stomachs, to march on bleeding feet, to endure suffering that would break these pampered workers. Material wealth was no substitute for spiritual strength, and spiritual strength, the Wehrmacht still believed, belonged to Germany. Feldwebel Böhmer, the tank commander who had watched America blaze past his train window, found himself caught between these positions. In his diary, preserved after the war, he recorded the internal struggle. January 3rd, 1944. "I do not know what to believe anymore. The men argue constantly. Some say America is weak despite appearances. Some say we have been deceived about everything. I only know what I saw. The trains, the factories, the lights. This is not a nation struggling to survive. This is a nation that does not know struggle at all. They have so much they cannot imagine having little. Can such a nation fight? Can such a nation win? I thought not. Now I am not certain." The uncertainty was itself a form of defeat, though Böhmer did not recognize it yet. Harder to rationalize were the small details, the evidence that accumulated not in grand displays, but in daily life. The camp guards who discarded half-eaten sandwiches, the work details that passed American farms, where a single family owned more machinery than a German village, the magazines and newspapers available in the camp library, filled with advertisements for products that German civilians had not seen in years: automobiles, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, washing machines. Gefreiter Hans-Peter Ullmann, 19 years old and captured at Kasserine Pass, wrote to his mother in February 1944. The letter, preserved in the family archives, revealed a mind beginning to crack. "Mutti, I do not understand this country. Yesterday I worked on a farm. They pay us for work. Can you believe this? And the farmer gave me lunch. Roast beef, potatoes with butter, fresh milk. I ate until I was full, and there was still food remaining on the table. The farmer threw it to his dogs. His dogs eat better than we ate in Africa. How is this possible? We were told the Americans were suffering. We were told their workers were starving. Either we were told lies, or this farmer is the richest man in the world. He did not seem rich. He seemed ordinary. He had a machine for washing clothes and a machine for keeping food cold and 2 automobiles in his barn. Ordinary. This is what ordinary means here." The letter was censored before delivery, but the sentiment could not be censored from Ullmann's mind, or from the minds of thousands like him. The faith was beginning to fracture. The rationalizations were beginning to fail, and the true education had not yet begun. June 1944, Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. The moment that broke Feldwebel Karl-Heinz Böhmer was not a factory or a train. It was an apology. The summer heat had arrived early that year, pushing temperatures past 100 degrees by mid-morning. The barracks where Böhmer and his fellow prisoners slept had been fitted with an electric cooling system, a device that pumped chilled air through vents in the ceiling, keeping the interior bearable while Oklahoma baked outside. On June 6th, the system failed. Böhmer learned of the failure from an American sergeant named Patterson, who entered the barracks at 0700 with a work detail roster and an expression of genuine embarrassment. "Cooling's busted," Patterson said through the German-speaking prisoner who served as translator. "Maintenance says they'll have it fixed by tomorrow, maybe day after." He paused, removed his cap, and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Real sorry about that. It's gonna be a hot one." Böhmer stared at the sergeant. He did not understand the words at first. Not the English, the translator handled that, but the concept. An American soldier was apologizing to German prisoners because their air conditioning was not working. Air conditioning for prisoners of war. Böhmer had spent 2 years in North Africa, where summer temperatures reached 50 degrees Celsius, and men died of heat stroke in their tanks. He had watched friends ration water in the desert, trading ammunition for a few extra liters. He had lain in field hospitals where the wounded sweated through their bandages because there was no way to cool a tent in the Libyan sun. And now an American was apologizing because the machine that cooled the air in their prison barracks would be broken for 1 day, perhaps 2. "The sergeant seems upset," the translator said, watching Patterson leave. "He said he would try to find fans." Böhmer sat on his bunk and did not speak for the rest of the morning. Later, he would identify this moment as the turning point, not because of what it revealed about American wealth, which he had already witnessed, but because of what it revealed about American assumptions. The sergeant had not apologized strategically. He had not been performing for the prisoners. He had been genuinely uncomfortable that men in his charge, enemy soldiers who had killed Americans in combat, would be subjected to a hot day without mechanical cooling. This was not abundance. This was expectation. The Americans expected air conditioning in a prison barracks in Oklahoma because they expected air conditioning everywhere. The idea that men might simply endure heat, that discomfort was a normal condition of existence, had not occurred to Sergeant Patterson. He lived in a world where problems like excessive warmth were solved by machines, and when the machines failed, someone apologized. Böhmer wrote in his diary that evening, June 6, 1944, "Today I understood something I had been refusing to understand. The Americans are not showing us their wealth to impress us. They are not performing. This is simply how they live. Air conditioning in a prison. Apologies when it fails. They do not know any other way. They have never known scarcity. They have never known limits. How can we defeat a nation that apologizes to its enemies for a broken cooling machine? How can we defeat a nation that does not understand that some things cannot be fixed with machines? We cannot. We never could. The war was lost before I ever fired a shot. That same day, though Boomer would not learn of it until later, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The coincidence seemed, in retrospect, appropriate. The war was indeed being lost, on a scale that validated everything Boomer had begun to suspect. But the revelations were not finished. Unteroffizier Wendt, the same man who had watched the endless factory slide past the train window, experienced his turning point 2 weeks later, on a work detail at a canning facility outside Tulsa. The prisoners had been assigned to assist with the summer vegetable harvest, loading trucks with produce destined for processing and distribution to military installations across the country. It was hard work, but not brutal work, and the Americans paid them 80 cents per day in canteen scrip, money they could spend on cigarettes, candy, and other small luxuries. Wendt was stacking crates of tomatoes when he noticed something that stopped him mid-motion. The American workers, civilians, not soldiers, had driven themselves to work, not in buses, not in military trucks, in personal automobiles. He counted 14 cars in the facility's parking area, each one belonging to a different worker. Factory workers, cannery laborers, men and women who spent their days loading vegetables into trucks owned their own automobiles. In Germany, automobile ownership was a mark of significant wealth. Party officials had automobiles, factory owners had automobiles, senior military officers had automobiles, workers rode bicycles or took streetcars or walked. Here, workers drove. Wendt mentioned the observation to a fellow prisoner who dismissed it. Perhaps this factory pays very well. Perhaps these are skilled workers. But Wendt watched more carefully after that. He noticed the workers' lunches, not the thin soups and coarse bread of German factory canteens, but sandwiches thick with meat, fresh fruit, bottles of Coca-Cola pulled from an electric cooling cabinet that hummed quietly in the corner. He noticed their clothes, clean, well-fitted, replaced when worn rather than patched indefinitely. He noticed their shoes, leather, sturdy, without visible repairs. He noticed that they threw things away. A worker finished half a sandwich and discarded the remainder. Another opened a bottle of cola, drank 2/3, and left the rest on a windowsill where it went flat and was eventually poured out. A woman in the packing area peeled an apple, ate perhaps half, and tossed the rest into a bin with the vegetable scraps. They did not think about it. They did not hesitate. Waste was not a concept that applied to their lives. Wendt returned to the barracks that night and lay in his bunk for a long time without speaking. "What is it?" Boomer asked from the adjacent bed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," Wendt said. "I have seen the ghost of everything we believed. The workers at the factory, they are not rich. They are ordinary. And they live better than our officers lived. They throw away food. They own automobiles. They dress like our bourgeoisie. And they work in a vegetable cannery." He turned to face Boomer in the darkness. "We were told the Americans were weak because they were comfortable. We were told comfort made men soft. But these people are not soft. They work hard. They simply do not suffer while they work. They have found a way to be strong without being miserable. We did not believe this was possible. We were wrong." Boomer had no answer. Neither did any of the other prisoners who lay awake that night, staring at ceilings they could not see, listening to the hum of the repaired air conditioning, thinking about apple cores discarded without thought and automobiles owned by men who loaded trucks for a living. The rationalizations had run out. The only thing left was the truth. The truth arrived in waves, each one higher than the last, until the men who had once believed in German victory found themselves drowning in evidence they could not dismiss. Autumn 1944. The war news from Europe filtered into the camps through American newspapers, radio broadcasts, and the guards who sometimes shared information with prisoners they had come to regard as more nuisance than enemy. Paris had fallen to the Allies. The Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. The Thousand-Year Reich was dying in its 13th year. But for many prisoners, the news from Europe mattered less than the news from around them. The psychological war was being won not on distant battlefields, but in the details of daily American life. Camp Hearn, Texas, became a laboratory for disillusionment. The facility held over 4,000 German prisoners by late 1944, most of them veterans of the Afrika Korps and the Italian campaign. They lived in wooden barracks arranged around a central compound, worked on local farms and in nearby towns, and received a daily immersion in American abundance that no propaganda ministry could have designed more effectively. Hauptmann Wilhelm Förster, a company commander captured at Anzio, kept a meticulous journal throughout his captivity. The entries from October 1944 read like the field notes of an anthropologist studying an alien civilization. October 3rd, work detail at the cotton farm. The owner, a man named Henderson, has 3 tractors. 3. In Germany, an entire collective might share 1 tractor. He uses these machines to harvest cotton, which he sells at government-supported prices. He showed me his account books, not boasting, but simply explaining. His income last year was $14,000. A factory worker in Stuttgart earns perhaps 2,000 Reichsmarks. Henderson is a farmer, working the same land his grandfather worked, and he earns 7 times what a skilled German laborer earns. He does not consider himself wealthy. He considers himself comfortable. October 7th, the camp received a shipment of winter clothing. Each prisoner was issued 2 wool blankets, a heavy jacket, gloves, and boots. New. Not used, not repaired, new. I asked the supply sergeant if this was standard. He seemed confused by the question. "You need to stay warm," he said. "What else would we give you?" I did not have an answer. In the Wehrmacht, we wore the same boots until they fell apart. These Americans give their prisoners new boots because the alternative has not occurred to them. October 12th. A revelation today that I am still processing. The mess hall served steak for dinner. Beef steak cooked to order with potatoes and vegetables and fresh bread. The man ahead of me in line, a Gefreiter from the 90th Light Division, received his portion, examined it, and asked for a different cut. "This one's too fatty," he said. The cook replaced it without comment. A prisoner of war rejected food and received better food. In Russia, men killed each other over potato peels. Here, prisoners critique the marbling on their steaks. I ate my portion in silence and thought about the men I left behind in Italy, eating field rations when they could find them. We are in different worlds. We have always been in different worlds. We simply did not know it. The steak incident became legendary among the Camp Hearn prisoners, not because it was exceptional, but because it was not. The mess halls served meat at nearly every meal. Prisoners gained weight. Men who had arrived gaunt from the deprivations of combat and capture found themselves softening around the middle, their uniforms growing tight, their bodies forgetting the hunger that had been their constant companion. Oberleutnant Chrysler, the same officer who had dismissed American abundance as a trick upon his arrival, recorded his own capitulation in December 1944. I was wrong. I have spent 6 months searching for the deception, waiting for the mask to slip, expecting to discover that America is as I was told it would be. The mask has not slipped. There is no mask. This is what they are. They are a nation so wealthy that they do not understand they are wealthy. They waste food because they have never known its absence. They discard clothing because they have never worn patches. They cool their prisons in summer and heat them in winter because the alternative would be uncomfortable, and they see no reason for discomfort. I told my men this was performance. It is not performance. It is reality. And against this reality, what chance did we ever have? The question echoed through the camps as 1944 gave way to 1945, and the evidence continued to accumulate. Prisoners assigned to work details in American cities returned with reports that strained credulity. Oberfeldwebel Stahl, who had insisted that American poverty must exist somewhere, was assigned to a road crew in San Antonio and came back shaken. "I saw the poor neighborhoods," he told his barracks mates. "I looked for them specifically. I found them. Houses smaller than the others, yards not as well kept, cars older, not as clean." He paused. "The poor Americans have houses. They have yards. They have cars. Their children wear shoes. Their women wear dresses without patches. This is what poverty means here. In Hamburg, this would be prosperity. In Berlin, this would be wealth. Their poor live better than our middle class lived before the war. There is no comparison. There was never a comparison. We were fighting a nation that does not know what scarcity means. The industrial evidence was equally devastating. Prisoners who worked in or near American factories reported production figures that seemed impossible. A single automobile plant in Detroit could produce more vehicles in a month than all of Germany produced in a year. A single shipyard in California launched more tonnage in a week than the Kriegsmarine had lost since 1939. The numbers were not propaganda. They were simply numbers, the ordinary output of an industrial economy operating at war capacity. Feldwebel Böhmer received permission to visit a local library in early 1945 and spent an afternoon reading American industrial statistics. He returned to the barracks with a face the color of ash. "Do you know how many aircraft the Americans built last year?" he asked Wendt. "Do you know the number?" Wendt shook his head. 96,000. Boomer's voice was flat, drained of emotion. 96,000 aircraft in 1 year. Germany built 39,000, and we thought we were performing miracles. They built more than twice as many, and ships. They built ships faster than U-boats could sink them. They built tanks faster than we could destroy them. They built everything faster than we could stop them. He sat heavily on his bunk. The Führer said we would win because our will was stronger. Our will meant nothing. You cannot sink an aircraft carrier with will. You cannot stop a tank column with determination. You can only match production with production, and we were never even close. We were children fighting giants, and we did not know it because no one told us how tall the giants were. The realization spread through the camps like a contagion, not suddenly, but steadily, as each prisoner reached his own breaking point and found that the man beside him had reached it too. By spring 1945, the psychological transformation was nearly complete. The prisoners who had arrived believing in German superiority now understood that superiority had always been an illusion. The nation they had dismissed as decadent had outproduced, outfought, and outlasted them. The soft Americans had proven harder than German steel, and the hardest truth of all was the simplest. Germany had never had a chance. The war had been lost before the first shot was fired in the factories and farms and shipyards of a nation that did not know what limits meant. The prisoners were beginning to understand this now. Soon, they would be unable to understand anything else. The numbers told a story that required no interpretation. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States held 425,871 German prisoners of war on American soil. They were distributed across more than 500 camps in 45 states, from the pine forests of Wisconsin to the cotton fields of Mississippi, from the orchards of California to the industrial heartland of Ohio. They worked on farms, in factories, in forests, and on roads. They earned 80 cents a day and spent it in camp canteens stocked with goods that German civilians had not seen since 1939. And they watched. They watched America produce 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million military trucks. They watched American shipyards launch 6,500 naval vessels and 5,400 merchant ships, a fleet built from nothing in 4 years. They watched factories that had manufactured automobiles retool overnight to manufacture bombers, and then manufacture them at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes. They watched a nation that had possessed a smaller army than Portugal in 1939 field over 8 million soldiers by 1945. They watched, and they understood. The post-war testimonies of German prisoners held in America form one of the most remarkable archives of psychological transformation in military history. Hundreds of memoirs, thousands of letters, tens of thousands of interview transcripts, all telling variations of the same story. Men who arrived believing in German destiny and departed knowing it had been a fantasy. Hauptmann Wilhelm Förster, whose journal had documented his growing disillusionment, was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He settled in what would become West Germany and spent the rest of his life as a teacher of English and American studies. In 1971, he was interviewed by a documentary film crew researching the prisoner of war experience. "You want to know what America taught me?" Förster said to the camera. He was 73 years old, his hair white, his eyes still sharp. America taught me that everything I believed was a lie. Not a small lie, not a misunderstanding, a complete fabrication. We were told the Americans were weak, they were strong. We were told they were poor, they were wealthy beyond imagination. We were told they were divided, they were united in a way Germany never achieved. Every single thing we believed about our enemy was wrong. And do you know what is worse? We believed these lies because we wanted to believe them, because believing them made the war make sense. If the Americans were weak and decadent, then we could win. If they were strong and capable, then we were sending our sons to die for nothing. He paused, removed his glasses, wiped his eyes. I spent 2 years in America. I worked on their farms. I ate their food. I saw their factories and their cities and their ordinary people living ordinary lives. And every day I understood a little more that my country had sent me to fight a war that was lost before it began. This was not a lesson I wanted to learn, but America taught it to me anyway. The interviewer asked what single memory stayed with him most vividly. The garbage, Forster said without hesitation. The garbage that Americans threw away. I worked on a farm in Texas, and every week the farmer would pile his garbage by the road. Food scraps, broken tools, worn clothing, things that had simply become inconvenient. In Germany, we would have used these things for years. We would have repaired the tools. We would have patched the clothing. We would have eaten the scraps or fed them to animals. The Americans threw them away because throwing them away was easier than keeping them. They had so much that disposal was simpler than maintenance. When I understood this, truly understood it, I knew we had never had any chance at all. Similar testimonies accumulated across the decades. Feldwebel Karl-Heinz Böhmer returned to Germany in 1946 and eventually became a prosperous businessman in the Federal Republic. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, but his diary was published posthumously in 1989 after his death from natural causes. The final entry, written on the day of his repatriation, became widely quoted in German historical literature. May 17, 1946. I am leaving America today. I arrived as a soldier of the Reich, certain of victory, proud of my uniform, confident in my nation's destiny. I leave as something else. I do not have a word for what I am now. A man without illusions? A German who has seen beyond the propaganda? I do not know. I only know that I am different. America did not defeat me with weapons, though their weapons were formidable. America defeated me with abundance, with lights that blazed through the night, with trains that never ended, with farms where dogs ate better than soldiers, with prisons where the guards apologized for broken air conditioning. I cannot hate them. I cannot even resent them. They simply were what they were, a nation so powerful it did not need to prove its power. They let us see it. They let us watch them build and produce and consume and waste. And watching them, I understood that we had fought a war we could not win against an enemy we did not know. I go home now to rebuild Germany. I will remember what I have learned here. I will remember that strength without production is fantasy, that will without resources is suicide, that a nation's greatness is measured not by its speeches, but by its factories. I will remember. The diary's publication sparked renewed interest in the prisoner of war experience, and historians began collecting additional testimonies from survivors who had never told their stories. Unteroffizier Friedrich Wendt, the man who had watched workers throw away half-eaten apples in a cannery, was located in Hamburg in 1992. He was 84 years old, living alone in a small apartment surrounded by books about American history. I became obsessed, he told the interviewer who visited him. After the war, I could not stop thinking about what I had seen. How had they done it? How had they built so much, so quickly? I read everything I could find: economics, industrial policy, agricultural science. I wanted to understand. He gestured at the bookshelves lining his walls. I have spent 50 years trying to understand, and I think I finally do. The interviewer asked him to explain. They were not better than us, Wendt said. Not smarter, not harder working, not more virtuous. They were simply luckier. They had a continent. They had resources. They had oceans protecting them from invasion. And they had a system, a messy, chaotic, inefficient system that somehow produced more than any orderly system could produce. We believed that planning and discipline would defeat chaos and freedom. We were wrong. Chaos and freedom produced 96,000 aircraft in a year. planning and discipline produced 39,000. The numbers do not lie. They never lied. We simply refused to read them. He fell silent for a moment, then added, "The saddest part is that we could have known. The information was available. American production figures were not secret. Their factories were not hidden. Anyone who wanted to see could see, but we did not want to see. We wanted to believe we could win, and so we believed lies, and we sent our young men to die, and we lost everything." He shook his head. America did not defeat Germany. Germany defeated Germany. America simply showed us the truth we had been hiding from ourselves. The truth had been there all along. It had blazed from factory windows and rumbled through rail yards and hummed from electrical lines stretching to horizons that German prisoners had never imagined. And in the end, the truth was the only weapon that mattered. On a November night in 1943, Feldwebel Karl-Heinz Böhmer had pressed his face to the window of a transport train and watched America blaze past in the darkness. He had seen the factories that never stopped, the trains that never ended, the lights that burned as if darkness itself had been rationed out of existence. "This is not possible," Unteroffizier Wendt had whispered beside him. But it was possible. It was more than possible. It was ordinary. It was simply what America was, a nation so abundant that it did not recognize its abundance, so powerful that it did not need to proclaim its power, so wealthy that it gave its prisoners air conditioning and apologized when the system failed. The men on that train had been soldiers of the Wehrmacht, veterans of campaigns that had conquered Europe, believers in a destiny that would reshape the world. They had dismissed America as a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, soft people who had never known hardship and would crumble at the first test. They had been wrong about everything. The 425,000 German prisoners who passed through American camps during the war carried that wrongness home with them. They returned to a Germany in ruins, cities flattened by bombs that American factories had produced by the tens of thousands, armies destroyed by tanks that American workers had built by the hundreds of thousands, a nation starving while American farmers fed half the world. They tried to explain what they had seen. Many were not believed. Hauptmann Förster recalled the disbelief he encountered upon repatriation. "I told my family about the food, about the factories, about the workers with automobiles and the farmers with tractors. They thought I was lying. They thought the Americans had brainwashed me. How could I explain that no brainwashing was necessary? The Americans did not tell us we were wrong. They showed us. They simply let us see their country, and seeing it was enough. The seeing had been enough." Dr. Joseph Goebbels had promised that American wealth was merely a more comfortable form of weakness. The prisoners had discovered that American wealth was a weapon more devastating than any bomb. It could not be fought. It could not be matched. It could only be witnessed in helpless astonishment as the nation that was supposed to be collapsing produced more in a single year than Germany had produced in a decade. The German High Command had calculated that American workers were undisciplined, that American industry was disorganized, that American democracy was incapable of the sacrifices that total war demanded. They had studied the statistics of the Great Depression and concluded that the United States was a failing nation propped up by propaganda and luck. They had made a mistake that cost 10 million German lives. The prisoners knew this now. They had learned it not from lectures or re-education programs, but from the simple experience of living inside the enemy's homeland. They had eaten American food and worn American clothing and worked in American fields and factories. They had seen ordinary Americans, not the wealthy, not the elite, but ordinary workers and farmers, living lives of comfort that German generals could not match. And they had understood, finally, what they were fighting against. Not a nation, not an army, not even an industrial economy. They were fighting a civilization that had solved problems Germany did not know could be solved. A civilization that cooled its buildings in summer and heated them in winter, that fed its prisoners steak and apologized for the fat content, that threw away more food than German children would see in a year. A civilization that did not know it was extraordinary because it had never experienced anything else. This was the enemy the Reich had chosen. This was the enemy that could not be defeated. Feldwebel Böhmer understood this now. Wendt understood it. Förster and Chrysler and Stahl and Ullmann and the hundreds of thousands of other prisoners who had passed through American camps. They all understood it. The understanding had broken something inside them, some certainty that had sustained them through years of war, and what remained was not hatred or resentment, but something closer to awe. They had been captured by American soldiers, but they had been defeated by American factories, American farms, American trains rolling through the night, loaded with more war material than Germany could produce in a year. They had been defeated by electric lights blazing without fear of bombers, by workers driving personal automobiles to jobs in canneries, by guards apologizing for broken air conditioning in prison barracks. They had been defeated by abundance. In his final diary entry, written as he prepared to leave America forever, Boomer had captured the lesson that would haunt German prisoners for the rest of their lives. I will remember what I have learned here. I will remember that strength without production is fantasy, that will without resources is suicide, that a nation's greatness is measured not by its speeches, but by its factories. The factories had spoken, and their message had been heard by every German prisoner who pressed his face to a train window and watched America scroll past in the darkness, endless, inexhaustible, and utterly beyond anything the Reich had ever understood. They had come to America as prisoners of war. They left as prisoners of truth.